Now, the federal government has been urged to apologise for its Robodebt scheme as it prepares to refund more than $700 collected by the program after it was challenged in court. Around 370,000 people were affected.
Let's bring in now our poly panel. We're joined by Labor's Senator Tim Ayres and Liberal MP Fiona Martin. Good morning to you both. Thanks for joining us this morning. Now, last hour we were speaking to a legal aid lawyer who represented one person who'd been caught up in this Robodebt claim and who didn't have this debt, and that was proven to be the case. And she was she had her debt dealt with, but there hasn't been any payment for the distress caused. And this legal aid lawyer was talking about the intense distress caused by some of these people who received debt notices incorrectly. Fiona Martin, should the government be going further than they are at the moment?
Well, the income compliance program was developed to make identifying welfare overpayments more efficient. And as you know, from the 1st of July, in good faith, the government will be repaying the payments, and the Minister acknowledges the ATO data was not sufficient, and we have made steps to rectify this.
But I'm asking, should it go further to acknowledge the distress and compensate people for the distress and pain caused?
Well, I think, any distress, is not ideal, and obviously it's a very difficult circumstance to work through, but the government is working to rectify this, and the Minister has acknowledged that the ATO data was not sufficient in being able to identify the welfare overpayments.
Senator Tim Ayres, Minister Stuart Roberts, when he spoke about this Robodebt and about the refund and the waiving of these debts as well, there was no apology. And we've heard a lot of people say, well, at least an apology is needed. Is that something that you would encourage as well?
Well, of course there should be an apology. The way that this announcement was made 15 minutes after the Prime Minister had finished a press conference where he didn't mention this decision that the government had made at all, wasn't subject to any scrutiny by the journalists who'd assembled to speak to him. Stuart Roberts' press conference 15 minutes later just showed the contempt that the government has for welfare recipients. Of course they should apologise. These are some of the most vulnerable people in our community, people who worry about whether or not they're going to be able to pay their rent, people who worry about whether or not they're going to be able to allocate money to food for their kids, or to clothes for their kids. Every week, an awful lot of pressure on this section of the community, and the government established a flawed, now illegal Robodebt scheme that turns out to have targeted many people who should never have been targeted, people who got notices to tell them that they owed the government money. It's caused immense distress and immense harm in sections of the community. An apology would be a very good start. But there's got to be a very high level of accountability about the flawed administration of this very bad scheme.
Fiona, on Tim's point there, this announcement was made, as he said, just minutes after the Prime Minister gave his press conference. It was also made on a Friday afternoon, which is usually called the take out the trash time. Given how great this error was and how much harm was caused, is that really good enough that this was made at that time when the Prime Minister couldn't answer his questions?
Well, this is something that the Minister, as soon as the Minister became aware of the issue, he paused the program, and he has been working systematically to review the program to ensure that it is improved.
Sorry, I'm asking you about the time of this announcement.
Yes, so the Minister spoke about this yesterday, and the issue has now been addressed. So he has acknowledged that the ATO data was not sufficient, and he's making steps to rectify it.
Fiona, you said that the Minister paused the system as soon as it was flagged to him that it wasn't working. In fact, between the years of 2017 and 2019, the Department of Human Services says that the administrative appeals, it was 2016 and 2019, more than a third of all robo-debt decisions were overturned by the Administrative Appeal Tribunal. Surely those red flags should have come up between 2016 and 2019. Why was it only paused last year?
Well, Minister Robert first became aware of the problem in November 2019. And when he became aware of the problem,
but the Administrative Tribunal Appeal had already warned the government, had warned the Centrelink at least 5 times. We spoke to Professor Terry Carney in the last hour, and he was he had rebuked the government and Centrelink on 5 different cases about this particular scheme, saying it is illegal, it is unenforceable. The administrative says that the Senate estimates show that between 2016 and 2019, more than a third of all robo-debt decisions were overturned by the tribunal. Red flags were going up way before last year. Why wasn't it paused earlier?
Well, as I said, the minister first became aware of the problem in November 2019, and at that point, the program was paused. I can't speak on behalf of the minister, and I think that, you know, in terms of further questions, they're best directed to the minister on this issue.
Oh, come on, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that you're asking the right questions. There have been red flags on this scheme all the way through. The only new information that the minister got was an increasing awareness that he was about to be in the witness box for his administration of a scheme that has damaged so many Australian lives. Last Friday, it was an announcement late on Friday afternoon about a $60 billion error in the government's JobKeeper scheme. You know, the Americans spent less money putting a man on the moon, a $60 billion error. This Friday afternoon, it's a $720 million bungled, unfair robo-debt scheme. I really worry about what next Friday afternoon is going to bring.
Fiona, is there scope for this compensation for harm and distress, for this payments to be extended? Is that something that you would like to see?
Well, you know, as I said, this is probably best answered by the minister. At this point, I'm aware that the minister has acknowledged that the ATO data is insufficient and that he's made steps to rectify it. I think further questions about this is probably best directed to the minister.
We're going to move on to another story that made headlines this week, and the government is pushing ahead with industrial relations reforms. And they've said that they will go ahead to do this, even if unions and employers aren't able to bridge their differences. Of course, now they're sitting down with many workers' representation groups, as well as employers' groups as well. Senator Tim Ayres, shouldn't Labor be at this table as well?
Well, it's unremarkable that a government would meet with the trade union movement. I mean, with this government, you have to look behind the headlines. It's apparently a headline moment that the government meets with the trade union movement about matters related to the regulation of work. Now, that is unremarkable around the world. And in fact, governments around the world have been working with their trade union partners around all sorts of issues related to the COVID-19 crisis, getting people back to work. Scott Morrison's announced a very narrow agenda. He's booked a room for meetings with the ACTU leadership. And the ACTU leadership have played a very important role during the course of this crisis. And it's absolutely, absolutely straightforward development that the government would meet with them. What is remarkable is that for the 7 years of this government, they've pursued a anti-worker, anti-union agenda, and it's taken a national crisis of the proportions of this pandemic to get them to the realisation that they should meet with the trade union movement. I'm suspicious about the timing of this announcement. It occurred in the middle of a speech that was supposed to be about vocational education reform, where the government didn't announce very much, actually, about vocational education reform. I hope that these discussions go well. We'll watch them with interest. But it is an unremarkable development that a government meets with the trade union movement.
Fiona, Tim Ayres says it's an unremarkable development for the government to be sitting down with the unions, but for a coalition government and the history of this coalition government, it is actually a bit remarkable that it's sitting down in this way and that this unlikely friendship has sort of formed between the government and unions, people like Sally McManus, over this time of the pandemic. Should workers feel nervous about this relationship being formed and these talks happening? How can the government guarantee that the power of unions and the rights of workers won't be diluted through this process?
They should be feeling optimistic. If anything, this process, which is ultimately about creating jobs, is, our Minister for Industrial Relations, Christian Porter, is leading the way in creating a collaborative approach where, the members of, industry groups, the government, employers, employees come together and create practical solutions, sensible industrial relations reform, long-lasting sensible industrial relations reform, targeting 5 issues through working groups, one of which is award simplification. And this is about long-lasting reform. It's about creating jobs. And at a time like this, that is what we need. We need Team Australia. We need collaboration. And we ultimately need jobs.
This government's really only got one speed when it comes to work, the regulation of work, wages and jobs. It's about cutting wages. It's about decreasing workers' rights at work. And that's the agenda that it's pursued for the whole 7 years. Now, if there's going to be a road to Damascus moment where the government wants to engage with the trade union movement about lifting wages, about reducing the level of casual, precarious work in the economy, about increasing the number of good jobs, well, I'll be watching it with a lot of interest. But this government's got a track record of 7 years of pushing in the opposite direction, rowing the boat in the opposite direction towards worse kinds of jobs, lower wages, stagnant wage growth. Well, let's watch this very closely, but I suspect it's another all spin, no substance announcement from this Prime Minister.
And we'll have to leave it there. Fiona Martin and Tim Ayres, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. Thanks for having us.